My father signed the paperwork that would let me die just 37 minutes after doctors told him how much my surgery would cost. Then he stood in my hospital room crying like the perfect father while telling everyone I was confused from trauma and medication. What nobody knew was that while I was unconscious, he had already forged my signature, stolen my grandmother's house, and used it to secure more than $300,000 in private loans. 3 months later, investigators were reviewing fraud filings tied to notarized documents submitted while I was still on a ventilator. The same man who spent 15 years preaching faith and sacrifice at church ended up standing alone in a rain-soaked parking lot while his entire life collapsed around him. Tonight's revenge story is about the moment I realized I was never hard to love. I was just raised by a man who treated my survival like a financial burden. Chapter 1. There are some sentences you never actually hear yourself, but they still follow you for the rest of your life. Mine came to me 3 weeks later in a quiet ICU room that smelled like antiseptic and stale coffee, when Patricia Dunn finally sat beside my bed and told me what my father said while doctors were trying to keep me alive. My name is Tessa Vale. I was 31 years old in the spring of 2024, working as a trauma nurse at Mid-State Regional Trauma Center outside Philadelphia. I had spent years helping strangers survive the worst nights of their lives. I knew what panic sounded like. I knew how people looked when someone they loved was dying. What I did not know was how calm a person could sound when they had already decided your life cost too much. The night of my accident, rain hammered against the hospital windows hard enough to blur the parking lot lights into white streaks. A pickup truck had blown through a red light on Route 202 and crushed the driver's side of my car. By the time paramedics got me to the hospital, I had broken ribs, internal bleeding, and a collapsed lung. The first surgery bought me a few more hours. The second one was supposed to save my life. Dr. Ethan Mercer explained everything to my father at the nurses' station. Patricia remembered every detail because she said the whole conversation made her stomach turn. My father stood there wearing his Navy Covenant Ridge Community Church volunteer jacket, still damp from the rain, while doctors explained that I might not survive the night without another emergency operation. He never asked if I was awake. He never asked if I was in pain. He asked how much the surgery would cost. Dr. Mercer told him insurance would help, but the total could still climb over $300,000 depending on complications. Patricia said my father looked more upset about the estimate than the fact that I might die. Then he sighed and rubbed his forehead like somebody had handed him another overdue bill. She has been a financial burden since the day she was born. That was what he said. Patricia stood less than 6 feet away when he signed the DNR paperwork in case my heart stopped before the next surgery. He signed the paper, then he went home. The truth is, part of me was not even shocked when Patricia told me later. I grew up understanding exactly what I was inside my father's mind: expensive. That was the word attached to me for most of my life. I was born with a congenital heart defect in the late 1990s. Before I was old enough to remember faces clearly, surgeons had already opened my chest and repaired the thing inside me that came broken. My mother rarely talked about that surgery afterward, but my father never stopped talking about it. Every argument in our house eventually circled back to money. Every money conversation eventually circled back to me. I remember sitting at the kitchen table in middle school while my father spread insurance statements across the counter like evidence in a criminal case. He would tap numbers with one finger and remind me how lucky I was that he had worked overtime for years to keep us afloat. Some parents make their children feel loved. Mine made me feel expensive. By 5th grade, my sneakers had holes worn through both soles. I stuffed cardboard inside during winter because I already knew what would happen if I asked for new ones. My father would get quiet first, then disappointed, then angry that I could ask for anything after what the family had already sacrificed. So I stopped asking. I skipped field trips when permission slips came home with payment envelopes. I bought my own notebooks after school with grocery store money. I learned how to smile and say I didn't really want things before anyone had the chance to tell me I didn't deserve them. My older sister, Natalie, lived in a completely different version of the same house. When she turned 17, my father bought her a used Toyota and stood in the driveway grinning while neighbors congratulated him. He paid most of her real estate tuition because he called it an investment in her future. When I got accepted into nursing school, he handed me student loan forms. Natalie was the future investment. I was the expensive child. For years, I honestly believed if I became useful enough, maybe my father would finally stop looking at me like unpaid debt. I worked double shifts. I never complained. I became the daughter who apologized for everything, including taking up space. The only person who never treated me that way was my grandmother, Evelyn. She lived alone in a small white house on Maplewood Lane, with lavender bushes lining the porch railings and wind chimes that rattled softly every evening. After church on Sundays, I would sit beside her on the old porch swing while she handed me sweet tea and asked questions nobody else ever asked. Did you eat today? Are you sleeping enough? Why do you always look guilty for existing? I usually laughed those questions away, but she never did. During the last year of her life, she started locking her bedroom door whenever my father visited. Once, I caught her sliding paperwork into an old metal box the second she heard his truck pull into the driveway. 3 months before she died, she squeezed my hand so tightly her wedding ring pressed into my skin. One day, a lawyer named Victor Hale is going to come looking for you. When that happens, don't let your father scare you. I thought grief was making her paranoid. I was wrong. Her funeral took place at Covenant Ridge Community Church on a gray Thursday afternoon. My father controlled everything. He spoke about sacrifice, faith, and family loyalty, while half the congregation nodded like he was some kind of saint. When I quietly asked if I could say something about my grandmother, he told me we didn't need to drag the service out any longer. People at church loved my father. They trusted him with donation money. They called him generous. None of them knew he kept score every time he spent money on his own daughter. 3 months later, after a 12-hour shift at the hospital, I drove home through cold spring rain with my grandmother's last words still echoing somewhere in the back of my mind. I remember stopping at the red light near the old gas station on Route 202. I remember headlights suddenly appearing from my left, too fast, way too fast, and for one terrible second, right before the truck slammed into my car, I remember thinking my father would finally be free of me. The next thing I remember after the crash was somebody yelling for blood across the trauma bay. Not my name, not "stay with us," just blood. Everything else from that night was stitched back together later through Patricia Dunn, because while doctors fought to keep my body alive, my mind disappeared somewhere deep and unreachable for almost 2 weeks. Patricia told me Mid-State Regional looked like chaos after midnight that night. Rainwater covered the emergency room floor in dirty footprints. A teenager was overdosing 2 rooms down. Somebody near radiology kept screaming for their mother. The entire hospital smelled like antiseptic, coffee, and wet jackets. Then, paramedics rolled me through the doors. Patricia recognized me immediately. "Oh my God, that is Tessa." She said it was surreal watching people cut away my clothes in the same trauma bay where I had spent years helping other patients survive. One minute, I was a nurse on those halls. The next, I was the body everyone was trying to save. Dr. Ethan Mercer took control the second they transferred me onto the table. Collapsed lung, possible splenic bleed, pressure is dropping. Move now. Nobody wasted time. The first surgery lasted almost 2 hours. It stopped enough bleeding to keep me alive through the night, but not enough to stabilize me completely. Internal bleeding was still spreading, and sometime around 1:30 in the morning, Ethan walked out to update my father. Patricia said Raymond Vale never once asked to see me first. That was what bothered her immediately. Most parents rush toward the ICU doors. They want proof their child is still breathing. My father walked straight toward billing. Ethan explained everything carefully. Your daughter survived the first surgery, but she is still in critical condition. There is additional bleeding, and we may need another operation very soon. How soon? My father asked. Within hours. And if you do not operate, then she probably dies. Patricia said Ethan looked exhausted when he answered, like he had already spent the night dragging people back from the edge and did not have energy left for another conversation about money. But money was exactly where my father went. If she survives, will she even be able to work normally again? Ethan frowned. Right now, we are focused on saving her life. I understand that, but if she cannot work for months, what happens financially? Patricia told me the whole hallway seemed to go quiet after that. Even the typing at the nurses' station slowed. Everybody understood what he was really asking. Ethan explained insurance would cover part of the surgery, but rehab and long-term recovery could still become expensive depending on complications. My father stared at the estimate sheet for several seconds without saying anything. Then he asked whether the hospital would continue billing if a patient died during surgery. Patricia said that was the moment something inside her turned cold. People at Covenant Ridge Community Church thought my father was generous. They trusted him during donation drives. They asked him to lead prayer circles whenever somebody got sick. None of those people would have recognized the man standing in that hallway. Ethan answered carefully. We would still continue all stabilizing treatment unless there was a signed DNR order. My father rubbed his forehead and let out a long breath. Then he said the sentence Patricia would never forget. She's been a financial burden since the day she was born. Nobody spoke after that. One nurse looked down at her clipboard. Another quietly walked away from the desk because she didn't want her face showing what she was thinking. Patricia said her hands were shaking so badly she almost dropped a chart. But legally, my father still had authority at that point because nobody had checked my employee healthcare proxy yet. Ethan tried one last time. Sir, signing this does not stop treatment. We are still doing everything we can for her. My father signed the DNR paperwork anyway. Then he handed the pen back like he was signing for a delivery package. At almost 3 in the morning, Patricia watched him leave the hospital through rain-covered glass doors. What haunted her most was what happened next. He stopped at a drive-thru across the street for coffee before going home. He slept while surgeons prepared to open my body again. The worst part is, hearing all this later still didn't fully shock me. By 25, apologizing became a reflex I couldn't control anymore. I apologized when people bumped into me. I apologized when I got sick. I apologized any time I needed help. Growing up with Raymond Vale trained me to believe survival itself came with debt attached. I honestly thought if I worked hard enough, maybe one day he would stop sounding disappointed every time he looked at me. Naomi Reed was the only person who ever called that what it was: emotional abuse. Patricia found Naomi listed inside my healthcare proxy nearly an hour after my father left. The document was buried deep inside employee HR records instead of regular intake paperwork. She called Naomi at 3:47 in the morning. Hello? Naomi, this is Patricia Dunn from Mid-State Regional. Tessa was in a serious accident. The silence lasted maybe 2 seconds. Is she alive? Barely. You're listed as her medical proxy. If you want your friend alive, you need to get here now. Patricia said Naomi arrived soaked from the storm, with mascara smeared beneath her eyes and her sneakers dripping water across the ICU floor. Where is she? Right through those doors. Patricia handed her the paperwork. Naomi read the DNR order once, then looked up sharply. Her father signed this? Yes. Can he legally do that? Not if your proxy is valid. Naomi grabbed the pen immediately, then revoke it. Patricia told me that moment changed everything. While surgeons prepared another operating room, Naomi sat outside wrapped in a thin hospital blanket, shaking from cold, fear, and anger. She kept muttering the same sentence over and over. I knew he would do something like this someday. Years earlier, during nursing school, Naomi found me crying inside my car after my father accused me of being selfish for taking unpaid clinical hours. I remember staring at the steering wheel while telling her maybe he was right. Maybe I really did make life harder for everybody around me. Naomi looked horrified. Tess, love should not feel like repayment. I didn't understand that sentence back then. At 4:30 in the morning, Naomi officially authorized the second surgery less than 20 minutes before the operating room slot would have been reassigned. Patricia squeezed her shoulder. Thank God she chose you. The surgery lasted nearly 6 hours. Right after sunrise, Ethan finally walked into the waiting room, still wearing blood-stained scrubs. She made it through. Naomi burst into tears. My father never returned to the hospital that morning. Instead, he drove to my grandmother's house on Maplewood Lane and walked through her kitchen like he already owned it. Over the next week, he quietly collected old paperwork with my signature on it, student loan documents, insurance forms, medical releases, anything he could trace, anything he could copy. Natalie started noticing strange things around the house: locked garage doors, whispered phone calls, folders disappearing whenever she walked into a room. One night, she overheard a man shouting through speakerphone, "You promised the property would clear this week." "I'm handling it," my father snapped back. "You better be." Natalie still came to the hospital sometimes, but Patricia noticed she could barely look anyone in the eye anymore, like guilt was slowly eating her alive from the inside. 3 weeks later, somewhere between the steady beep of monitors and the smell of antiseptic drifting through the room, I finally opened my eyes. Patricia Dunn was sitting beside my bed, holding my hand, and the look on her face told me waking up was only the beginning. Chapter 3. The pain hit me in waves after I woke up. Some mornings it settled deep in my ribs like broken glass. Other times it sat behind my eyes, heavy and dull, making the entire room feel slow and distant. But physical pain was easy compared to confusion. Everybody around me acted nervous in ways they could not fully hide. Patricia became quiet every time my father entered the room. Natalie kept forcing smiles that disappeared too quickly. And Raymond asked the same question so many times, it eventually stopped sounding casual. "What do you remember before the crash?" At first, I thought he was worried about brain damage. Then he asked again the next morning, and again that night. "What is the last thing you remember clearly, Tess?" By the fourth time, something inside me started paying attention. The rehab transition room overlooked the east parking lot at Mid-State Regional. Every morning, I watched nurses dragging themselves through the rain with oversized coffees, while machines beeped steadily beside my bed. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw headlights. Then, Patricia finally told me why she looked sick every time my father touched my shoulder. She closed the room door softly before sitting beside my bed. "I need to tell you something, honey." The second she said it, I knew my life was about to split into before and after. Patricia looked exhausted, like she had been carrying something too heavy for too long. "The night they brought you in, your father asked about surgery costs before he asked whether you were alive." I stared at her. "What?" "He wanted numbers first." "No." The word came out automatically, not because I truly doubted her, because some part of me still needed to believe there was a line my father would never cross. Patricia kept talking quietly. "He asked Dr. Mercer whether you would ever work normally again if you survived." I felt my chest tighten. Then she told me about the DNR paperwork, the timing, the billing office, the exact sentence. "She has been a financial burden since the day she was born." I turned my face toward the window because I could not let her watch me break apart. The worst thing about hearing it was realizing how familiar it sounded. My entire childhood suddenly rearranged itself into something ugly and obvious. The comments about medical bills, the guilt every time money got tight, the way my father looked at Natalie with pride and looked at me with exhaustion. He never saw me as his daughter. He saw me as debt that survived too long. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Finally, Patricia reached for my hand. "I'm so sorry." I nodded slowly, but the truth was, something inside me had already started changing. Not healing, hardening. I spent years trying to become easy enough to love. That day, I realized nothing would ever be enough for him. That night, I asked Naomi to bring me my phone. There was one thing I could not stop thinking about: my grandmother. More specifically, her last warning. "One day, a lawyer named Victor Hale is going to come looking for you." The next afternoon, I called his office from my hospital bed. The receptionist transferred me immediately after hearing my name. Victor sounded older than I expected, calm, controlled. "Tessa, you know who I am? I have been trying to reach you for months." Cold moved through my stomach instantly. "What do you mean?" "I sent certified letters after your grandmother passed. None were answered." "I never got anything." "I suspected that." His voice changed slightly after that. "Your father intercepted more than one phone call as well." I stared down at the hospital blanket covering my legs. Something inside me went very still. 2 days later, Naomi drove me to Victor's probate office in Montgomery County. I was still weak enough that getting into the car exhausted me. Rain covered the streets again. Pennsylvania in March always looked gray and tired. Victor's office sat above an insurance agency in an old brick building that smelled like dust, paper, and stale coffee. Legal files covered almost every surface. The second he saw me, his expression softened. "You look exactly like Evelyn." That nearly shattered me by itself. Victor opened a thick folder slowly. "Your grandmother prepared very carefully before she passed." I tried to steady my breathing. "What does that mean?" He slid paperwork across the desk toward me. "The house on Maplewood Lane was left entirely to you." I blinked at him. "What?" "There was also a trust worth approximately $92,000. Naomi swore softly under her breath beside me. I kept staring at the papers without really seeing them. My grandmother left everything to me, not Raymond. Me. Then Victor's face darkened. That is where the situation becomes complicated. He placed another stack of documents onto the desk. I immediately recognized my signature, or something pretending to be my signature. "The transfer paperwork was filed while you were still unconscious and on a ventilator." The room went completely silent. Victor pointed toward the bottom of one page. "Notice the notarized timestamp, March 18th. I was still in critical care. There's also a forged power of attorney attached to the filing." I felt Naomi shift beside me. Victor kept going carefully. "Your father used the property to secure a private collateral loan for approximately $325,000. I could barely process the number. "What?" "It appears to be a hard money lending arrangement, not a traditional mortgage, which means if fraud is proven quickly enough, we may be able to freeze everything before the property changes hands." My chest started hurting again, but it was not from surgery this time. It was rage. Suddenly, I pictured my father walking through my grandmother's kitchen while I lay unconscious in intensive care, opening cabinets, checking drawers, looking at her house like he was pricing everything inside it. Something inside me stopped begging for his love that day. Victor handed me a folded letter with my grandmother's handwriting across the front. My fingers shook before I even opened it. Inside, Evelyn apologized for not protecting me sooner. She admitted Raymond had taken money from her before. She wrote that she spent years watching me apologize for existing inside my own family. Then I reached the final line. "You were never expensive to love." I broke down crying so hard, Naomi had to hold on to my shoulders. When we finally left the office, the rain had stopped, but the cold inside me had not. That evening, I returned home briefly to collect clothes from my apartment. My father was in the garage with the door half closed, speaking loudly into his phone. "I just need a few more days to finalize paperwork." I froze outside the doorway. Then I heard the man on speaker answer, "You promised the property would clear this week." Property. Not house, not paperwork. Property. Like my grandmother's life had already been reduced to numbers. Natalie walked into the hallway seconds later and stopped cold when she saw me standing there. Her face went pale immediately. "Tess," I looked directly at her. "You knew about the house, didn't you?" She opened her mouth, then closed it again. That silence told me everything. And for the first time in my life, I stopped wanting to protect my family from the truth. Chapter 4. Rain hammered the church windows the night my father's entire life finally started collapsing in public. By then, I was still moving carefully because of my ribs. Every deep breath reminded me my body had not fully healed yet. Bruises still shadowed my side beneath my sweater, and my right hand shook slightly every time I held something too long, including the folder resting against my chest. Naomi noticed immediately while we crossed the Covenant Bridge parking lot. "You can still walk away," she said softly. I looked through the rain-covered glass doors toward the warm lights inside. "No," I answered. "I spent my whole life walking away from things to keep him comfortable." Naomi did not argue after that. The monthly church gathering was already crowded when we walked inside. Folding tables filled the fellowship hall. Children ran between chairs while older women carried trays of baked pasta and cookies toward the serving tables. Everything looked painfully normal, and right in the middle of it all stood Raymond Vale. My father laughed beside Pastor Caleb, with one hand resting casually on somebody's shoulder. Church members kept stopping to hug him or ask how I was recovering. "There she is." His voice carried across the room immediately after he spotted me. Several people turned at once. My father crossed the hall smiling warmly before wrapping both arms around me like we were the perfect family everybody believed we were. "Look at you," he said loudly. "God is good." I smelled coffee on his breath. His hand pressed lightly against my back. Not comforting, controlling. Around us, people smiled sympathetically. "We prayed for you every night. Your father never stopped talking about you. That man loves his family." Every sentence felt surreal after everything I knew now. Across the room, Patricia stood near the kitchen entrance holding a paper cup in both hands. The second our eyes met, I saw it again. Disappointment. Not anger. Something heavier, like she still could not fully process what kind of man my father really was. Dinner dragged on for almost an hour, while I sat beside Naomi pretending I could still tolerate hearing my father speak about faith and sacrifice. Then, Pastor Caleb finally stepped toward the microphone near the front of the hall. "We are blessed tonight to have Tessa back with us." People applauded softly. "And Brother Raymond wanted to say a few words before we close." My father stood slowly while adjusting his tie. Calm, confident, completely at home. For 15 years, he built himself into the kind of man people trusted automatically. Church volunteer, community fundraiser, faithful husband, reliable deacon, the man who prayed over hospital beds and delivered food after funerals. The man who signed paperwork to let his daughter die 37 minutes after hearing surgery costs. My father smiled modestly at the crowd. "I just want to thank everybody here for supporting my family through the hardest season of our lives." His voice softened perfectly. When something like this happens, it reminds you what truly matters: faith, family, sacrifice. Liar. The word hit so hard inside my head, I could barely hear the applause afterward. Then suddenly, I realized something. I was done begging him to become a father. I stood before fear could stop me. "Can I say something?" The room quieted immediately. My father's face tightened for half a second before the smile returned. "Of course, sweetheart." I walked slowly toward the front of the hall while every pair of eyes followed me. My ribs burned with each step, but I kept moving anyway. The folder felt heavier in my hands now. Pastor Caleb offered me the microphone. "You do not have to stand too long," he said kindly. I nodded once. Then I turned toward the room. People I had known since childhood stared back at me. Families who trusted my father, women who called him generous, men who respected him. People who still believed kindness and cruelty could not exist inside the same person. I took a slow breath. "I'm not here to talk about faith tonight." The room became completely silent. "I'm here to talk about truth." My father's smile disappeared immediately. "Tessa," he warned quietly. I ignored him. My father did not stay beside my hospital bed praying for me. A chair scraped loudly against the floor somewhere behind me. He signed paperwork to let me die. Somebody whispered, "Oh my God," under their breath. The silence afterward felt enormous. Pastor Caleb blinked in confusion, while my father let out a nervous laugh. "She's still recovering from serious trauma. The medication has affected her memory." Patricia stepped farther into the room behind the crowd. She never interrupted. She never denied it either. I looked directly at my father. "You asked doctors whether I would still be financially useful if I survived. Tessa, stop. You signed a DNR order 37 minutes after hearing surgery costs." Whispers spread instantly now. People shifted uncomfortably. Several church members started glancing toward my father instead of me. Then I repeated the sentence Patricia told me weeks earlier. "She has been a financial burden since the day she was born." A woman near the dessert table covered her mouth. Another slowly lowered her fork onto her plate. My father looked direct desperately. "That's not what I meant." Then the fellowship hall doors opened behind us. Rain blew briefly through the entrance as Victor Hale stepped inside, carrying a leather briefcase. The entire room quieted again. My father's face lost color instantly. Victor walked calmly toward the front without rushing. "I apologize for interrupting, but I believe this community deserves context." Pastor Caleb frowned slightly. "What exactly is going on here?" Victor opened the briefcase. "The original will belonging to Evelyn Mercer." He placed documents across the table one by one. "The forged power of attorney filed while Tessa Vale was unconscious and on a ventilator." Whispers exploded again. Victor continued calmly. "The deed transfer contains notarization inconsistencies and timestamp conflicts. The property was later used as collateral for a private hard money loan worth approximately $325,000. Nobody spoke after that. People just stared. Some at me, most at my father. Pastor Caleb picked up one document slowly. The disappointment on his face hurt more than anger would have. "Raymond," he asked quietly, "is any of this untrue?" My father finally snapped. "You have no idea what I sacrificed for this family." His voice echoed through the fellowship hall. "Do you know what her surgeries cost growing up? Do you know what it's like spending your entire life cleaning up somebody else's problems?" Then I said the thing I had needed him to hear for years. "You did not save my life. You just kept reminding me what it cost." Complete silence. Natalie suddenly stood so fast, her chair nearly tipped backward. Tears streamed down her face. "I knew about the paperwork. I knew he took documents from Tessa's apartment." My father spun toward her. "Natalie, I knew about the DNR too." The room physically changed after that. People started stepping away from him without realizing they were doing it, avoiding eye contact, creating distance, like the truth itself had become contagious. For the first time in my entire life, my father looked small. Not respected, not feared, just alone. Harold Bennett from the church board finally stepped beside Pastor Caleb. "Raymond, I think you need to leave." My father looked around the room, waiting for somebody to defend him. Nobody did. An hour later, rain poured across the church parking lot, while Raymond Vale stood alone outside the glass entrance doors, staring inside, and not a single person followed him into the storm. Chapter 5. The damage spread faster than I expected after the church confrontation. By the next morning, people across Covenant Ridge already knew some version of the story. Church group chats exploded overnight. Screenshots of legal filings started circulating before breakfast. Clients quietly canceled plumbing appointments without explanation. For years, my father controlled every narrative around our family. Then, suddenly, he could not control any of them. 3 days after the confrontation, Covenant Ridge removed Raymond Vale from his deacon position during an emergency board meeting. Pastor Caleb called me afterward. His voice sounded tired in a way I had never heard before. "I keep replaying everything in my head," he admitted quietly. "I should have seen something." I sat wrapped in a blanket on Naomi's couch while rain tapped softly against the apartment windows. It was never your job to save me from him. The line surprised even me after I said it, because for the first time in my life, I actually believed it. The legal fallout moved slowly after that, but it never stopped moving. Victor Hale handled most of it personally: fraud review, deed restoration, lien disputes, insurance investigations. Every week seemed to uncover another document connected to my father's plans. Carl Whitmore cooperated almost immediately once investigators started asking questions about notarization records and forged signatures. Victor explained it simply one afternoon while organizing paperwork across his desk. Most people panic when fraud stops being financial and starts becoming criminal. That was exactly what happened to my father. By early summer, his business was collapsing quietly in public. Longtime customers stopped returning calls. Church members avoided eye contact at grocery stores. One former client posted online about honesty and integrity without naming him directly, but everybody understood who the post was about. Reputation does not usually explode all at once. It leaks out slowly until there is nothing left to save. One afternoon, I drove past a diner near Lancaster Pike and saw my father sitting alone inside a booth near the window. 2 men from church walked in, noticed him, then chose another section entirely. For some reason, that image stayed with me longer than the church confrontation itself. Not because I felt guilty, because I finally understood something. Fear had always been the only thing keeping his world together. Meanwhile, my own world was slowly rebuilding itself in quieter ways. Physical therapy still hurt. Some mornings, my ribs burned badly enough that getting dressed exhausted me. But for the first time in years, my body no longer felt trapped in survival mode every second of the day. I slept through the night again. I stopped apologizing every time I needed help. I stopped shrinking myself to make other people comfortable. That might sound small to somebody else. To me, it felt like learning how to breathe for the first time. By late summer, the court officially ruled the power of attorney invalid because of forged authorization connected to my hospitalization timeline. The deed transfer was reversed, and Maplewood Lane legally returned to me. I cried in Victor's office after hearing the ruling, not because of the property, because something inside me finally stopped measuring my worth by what I cost other people. A week later, Victor uncovered another document connected to my father, an insurance beneficiary change, years old. My father had adjusted parts of the policy so financial payout structures benefited him if I died before he did. I stared at the paperwork while nausea rolled through me slowly. "He planned for this," I whispered. Victor removed his glasses tiredly. I think your father spent many years preparing for worst-case financial outcomes. Financial outcomes. Not grief, not loss, not his daughter dying, just numbers. I left Victor's office that afternoon feeling strangely calm instead of angry, like my nervous system had finally stopped waiting for my father to become somebody different. Natalie reached out a few days later, asking to meet at a coffee shop near the rehab center. She looked terrible when she walked inside. Dark circles under her eyes, nervous hands, shoulders pulled tight with tension. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then, finally, she said it. I knew about the DNR. The words landed heavily between us. I stared down at my coffee quietly while she kept talking. He told me everything would finally stabilize financially if things worked out. Worked out. The phrase made my stomach twist, like my death had become some family solution nobody wanted to say out loud. Natalie started crying almost immediately. I was scared, Tess. I believed her. That was what made it sad instead of satisfying. Fear shaped our entire family differently. My father controlled people with it. Natalie survived by obeying it. I survived by trying to earn love from it. None of us walked away untouched. I spent my whole life trying to make this family comfortable with my existence, I told her quietly. Natalie covered her face and cried harder, but she never argued because she knew it was true. For the first time, I also understood something important. Forgiveness does not mean reopening the door somebody destroyed you behind. Boundaries are not cruelty. Sometimes they are survival. By early fall, my father accepted a plea agreement tied to financial misconduct and fraudulent filings. No dramatic courtroom scene, no television cameras waiting outside. Real consequences usually arrive much quieter than revenge fantasies do. But he still lost almost everything he built his identity around: his church position, his business reputation, his community standing, his financial stability. The image he spent 15 years protecting disappeared in less than 6 months. My mother eventually moved to Ohio to live near her sister. Natalie quietly left real estate after clients stopped responding consistently. As for me, I returned to Mid-State Regional part-time before winter. Walking back through those hospital doors terrified me at first, but Patricia hugged me near the nurses' station so tight I nearly cried right there in the hallway. Naomi still checked on me constantly, even after I moved back out on my own. Some nights, the three of us sat together eating takeout in sweatpants while arguing about terrible television shows. Nothing dramatic, nothing life-changing, just safe. And honestly, those quiet evenings healed me more than revenge ever did. The first night I returned alone to Maplewood Lane as the legal owner, the entire house smelled exactly the same. Lavender, old wood, tea leaves, memory. The porch swing still creaked softly in the evening wind, exactly the way it had when my grandmother sat beside me years earlier, asking whether I had eaten enough that day. For the first time, the house finally felt like mine, instead of something I had to earn. I sat on the porch while sunset poured gold across the neighborhood trees. Then I unfolded my grandmother's letter one last time. Near the bottom of the page, her handwriting shook slightly. "You were never expensive to love." I pressed the letter against my chest and closed my eyes. For years, I believed family meant sacrificing pieces of yourself until other people allowed you to stay. But real love does not keep score. It does not turn survival into debt. And it does not make somebody apologize for existing. If somebody out there has ever made you feel like a burden simply because you were alive, I hope you remember this tonight. You were never difficult to love either. The porch swing moved gently beneath me while the last sunlight disappeared behind the trees, and for the first time in my entire life, I finally felt safe.